Mike, you look better.
Yeah, you were not here when Mike is recovering. For those that just came.
See, that's what it's going to look like when it's all done.
His nose done today. No, this. Yeah, he looks really good. He looks phenomenal. He does. He looks really good. And what can I tell you? He's gonna have a whole new nose when it's all done. He said that. He told me.
Yeah, it's going to look different.
A whole nose, a different nose. Anyway, so today we're taking a look at what's kosher, what's not kosher for food, for meat. We've already read one place in the Torah that you're not supposed, in Exodus, we've read you're not supposed to boil a kid in its mother's milk. So we already read a little bit about what you're supposed to eat, which was not in Leviticus. It was not specifically just for the priests. It was in the laws that we had in the Torah portion, Mishpatim. So we've read that. And now we're in Leviticus and we get a list of animals that we're not supposed to eat. Now, some people would say, well, this is in Leviticus. Is this just for the priests? The laws that we're about to say. Well, the phrase that we have a lot, Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe ve'Aaron, right? Spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, it says right here, speak to the Israelite people. So some people say, well, it's in Leviticus. It's not for the priest. Well, it says specifically, it's for the people. So these are not rules just for the priests, which means, again, Leviticus is not just for the priests. When sometimes people say, well, the laws are supposed to be so that the priests can be holy, that's not the case. It clearly says here that the priests are to some extent arbiters of this, which is maybe why it's in Leviticus. They're the teachers of it, but they're not the only people on who these laws are incumbent. But let's actually, before we look at why we have these restrictions, because they are restrictions, the Torah does explicitly say in the book of Genesis to Noah, God says to Noah, you may eat of the animals, right? And it's only after the flood that God says to Noah, you can eat of the animals. Because up until that time, it doesn't say that people could eat of animals. Maybe they could. I mean, some people say that they couldn't. Some people said that God gives people permission after Noah makes the sacrifice that they can do that. But regardless, here the Torah says, now, these are the animals that you can eat. So why is it restrictive? This is obviously just for it says the Israelite people. So why do the Israelites have these rules and other people don't have these rules? So that's a fair question to ask. It's a fair question to ask because it kind of gets to the point of is it, well, I guess you could say, is that a fair question to ask? And the answer is yes, because the rabbis do ask that question. Now, I'm going to show you one of their answers, and I'm going to show it to you because when I say the rabbi said this, they said it 2,000 years ago. And so I take no responsibility or necessarily agreement with what they said, but they do have a point here about it. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to share this midrash. It's a midrash. It's from the commentary on this. It's not from the Talmud. It's not a Talmudic passage, though there are Talmudic passages similar to this. This isn't in the Talmud. It's in the midrash. It's an explanation, but it's not a really politically correct one, but I'm going to share it with you anyways, because I think it's somewhat illuminating. It's somewhat, I think, hyper relevant, even though, like I said, I wouldn't agree with it. There's something about it that I think like somebody could have said recently. And it kind of still tells us a little bit about the mindset here, which is, I'm going to show it to you here. So this is some interesting stuff about eating kosher. So, and we might look at some of this other midrash here too. Here's one right here. I like this one, especially for someone who's been to the doctor today, like Mike. Again, I take no responsibility for this. I didn't say I agree with this, but I want to share it with you. And I want to share it with you so that you can see it, that I didn't make this up. Rabbi Tanhum ben Hanilai compared the laws of kashrut to the case of a physician who went to visit two patients, one whom the physician judged would live, and the other whom the physician judged would die. To the one who had lived, the physician gave orders on what to eat and what not to eat. On the other hand, the physician told the one who would die to eat anything that they wanted. That's the part that I think is super relevant. Somebody's going to die. What are you going to go in there and tell them what they can or can't eat? It shows you that even in the ancient world, people had that kind of attitude, which is, hey, if you don't have long to live, it doesn't matter. Enjoy life and go out, eat what you want. So it says that people did that thousands of years ago. I can picture someone saying that now. But here's the part that's not politically correct. And this is the part where you're like, oy. Thus to the nations who are not destined for life in the world to come, God said in Genesis 9:3, after the flood, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. But to Israel, whom God intended for life in the world to come, God said in Leviticus 11:2, these are the things which you may not eat. So I said, that's not the politically correct part. It's basically saying Jews have this law so that they can live in the world to come. Again, I don't agree with the Midrash. I'm not saying that it's something that I'm endorsing, but it does kind of give you an idea of the mindset of where the rabbis were on kashrut. And we'll look back at some of the Midrash on this too, because look, kashrut is one of the most important laws in the Torah. There's no question. It's one of the things that differentiates Jews and Gentiles, and it has for thousands of years. And it really has. I mean, that's one of the things I want to tell you. So we actually talked about this yesterday in our study of Kings, and talking about what archaeology says about the Jewish people and what they did. And as I shared yesterday, the archaeology of the land of Israel from 3,000 years ago shows that Jews had idols, and they weren't supposed to, and they knew they weren't supposed to, and yet they had them. And so that when the Torah says over and over again that the people had idols and that God got mad at them for having idols, the archaeology says that they had idols. It says so. But here's something interesting that I'm going to share with you, which you could also see with your own eyes. Look at this. Israel Finkelstein, who's not, by the way, a religious Jew. He's actually kind of what we call a biblical minimalist, which means he doesn't believe that a lot of the stuff that's in the Torah really happened. He actually he views the Torah as basically not historical. So he's not someone searching to try to make sure that actually people have issues with him a lot, because he seems to actually go out of his way to try to say that things aren't the way the Torah says them. So I want to say that out front about him. But Kugel, by the way, that's his name, James Kugel. He's a professor, was a professor of Bible. He says that he noted that Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein found no bones in the hilltop sites starting in the Iron Age period, Iron 1 period, 1200 to 1000 BCE, and continuing through Iron 2. While before that, in Bronze Age sites, pig bones abounded. Kugel deduced from Finkelstein's data that the new hilltop residents were fundamentally different from their predecessors in the highlands and in the city Canaanites, either because they were a different ethnic group or because they had adopted a different way of life for ideological or other reasons. Kugel inferred from Finkelstein's findings that these highlanders shared some ideology, if only a food taboo, like modern-day Jews and Muslims. Kugel concluded that this continues between the way of life of the Canaanite city dwellers and the earlier highland dwellers, supported the idea that the settlers were not exurbanites, which is also interesting from the standpoint of we still have those discussions about whether people moved from one place or the other and whether they take their kinds of traditions or their values with them, or they move because they don't have those values. But what's interesting is that the archaeology bears out that during this period after Moses, people don't, at least in some places in Israel, are not eating pig. And the archaeology will bear it out. So that's archaeology. So the archaeology shows that while we can't, again, make judgments about everything that's listed, because some of these things are not very easily found and would not normally be found, but pig bones would. And people did eat pigs in those days in parts of Israel. And there is a difference archaeologically by the areas where Jews lived, which are in the mountains, the Judean mountains. So that's I'm sharing with you for you to understand that this was something that was done, and the archaeology bears it out. So as much as the archaeology shows that people were still, during that period when they were not eating pig, they were also having idols. Certain things they did follow, and kashrut seems to be one of them. Can you get pigs nowadays in Israel? Yes, but they're not easy to find. It's not easy to find pork and shellfish in Israel. You can find it. It's just not easy to find. You can find it. It's not that it's not there, but you won't find it many places. All right. So let's take a look at the laws as they exist in chapter 11 and take a look at these rules. Speak to the Israelite people thus: these are the creatures that you may eat from among the land animals. Any animal that has true hoofs, with clefts through their hoofs, and that chew their cud, such you may eat. So they have to have two things, both things, chewing their cud and cleft hoof. So they can't have one and not the other. They must have both. So not one or the other. Now, there are several land animals that chew their cud and don't have split hooves. Camels being one of them. Horses, donkeys being another. These are animals that people had. How do we know? Well, the Bible says they had them. We have lots of references to those animals, and we know that we have bones, and archaeologically we know they had them. They couldn't eat them. Other cultures in the Middle East would eat animals or eat any kind of animal that died, or that lived in the community. They would eat them. Jews weren't allowed to eat some of the animals that they had, which is a sacrifice. I mean, you and I wouldn't think about it today because we would go, well, I don't want to eat a horse. But there are people who do. And when you have animal flesh that you can eat and it's expensive, and you don't have a lot of animals, or it's expensive to slaughter an animal, any animal like that would be of value to eat. Not least of which, you can't eat an animal unless it's slaughtered, which is a whole nother layer of difficulty for people, because the animal can't have died of natural causes or have been torn or killed by another animal. So all of those animals also can't be eaten, which could have been a kosher animal that just didn't die or was not slaughtered in a kosher way. So there's a lot of animals potentially that you couldn't eat. If your sheep was attacked by a wolf and was partly eaten, you don't get to eat the rest of it. Now you could say, well, would you really want to? Well, if they're expensive and if the animal's already dead, you'd be like, well, why can't I eat it? You can't. So that invalidates a whole lot of potential animal that you could eat. And it definitely happened. So this is a restrictive thing. Now, there are not a lot of animals that have split hooves and don't chew their cud. As a matter of fact, most of us, and even if you're a zoologist, it'd be tough. Most of us can't think of a lot of animals that have split hooves and don't chew their cud. But there is one really important one, which of course is, hello? What's that animal? What animal has a split hoof that doesn't chew its cud? Anybody? Don't all jump in at once. I'll show you a picture of it
Rabbit?
right here.
Oh, the pig.
Yeah,
Bacon.
he's got a split hoof, but he doesn't chew his cud. Now he's a tricky one. And the rabbis say he's tricky. Why? Because on the outside, if you ask somebody who didn't know anything about a pig, you look at his hooves and you go, oh, he's kosher. He's okay. Tasty. He's not kosher. And he's tricky because he is on the outside kosher, but not inside. You have to go into his gut to know that he doesn't have multiple stomachs. He's not a ruminant. And so the rabbis, since I have this open, I will show you their interesting midrash about this. They compared the Romans to a pig. Well, they didn't like the Romans, the rabbis, for lots of reasons. But here's what they said, a little midrash on the Romans. The swine, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, but does not chew its cud, is unclean. A midrash compared the pig to the Roman Empire. Just as a swine, when reclining, puts out its hooves as if to say, and again, while they're rolling around in the muck, the pig has its feet up, and he's like, look at me, I'm kosher. No, he's pretending. So too the Roman Empire boasts of its virtues as it commits violence and robbery under the guise of establishing justice. The Midrash compared the Roman Empire to a governor who put to death thieves, adulterers, and sorcerers, and then leaned over to a counselor and said, I did all these things in one night. So the Romans appear very civilized. They appear that they are in control. They appear like they know what they're doing and that they're just people, but they're not. So they're like a pig in that they appear good, but they're not. So the Romans were pigs, or were pigs from the kosher standpoint, in that they were not really, they're not really, and we're going to actually see specifically they're singled out. But that's a weird thing, because again, on the outside they look kosher, but inside they're not. Let's take a look though again. The following, however, those either that chew their cud or have true hooves, you shall not eat, right? Although it chews its cud, it has no true hooves. It's impure for it. It's the camel, as I said. The camels are important. And they had a lot of them. They kept them alive, but they couldn't do anything with them when they were ready to, if they were ready to eat them, can't do it. I'm not picking on them, but as you know, the Arabs, who obviously many of them, most of them became Muslim, followed the law of not eating pork, as you might know. But there is no law, by the way, in Islam of not eating shellfish. And there's no law in Islam of not eating camel, which was obviously a very important animal, land animal in the Muslim, specifically Arab world. And so camels are kosher for Muslims. I don't use the word kosher, but halal, they can be eaten. Most of us have no interest in eating camel in any form, but they are allowed to be eaten. And yeah, they would have been, and they still are technically edible, or permitted for Muslims, but Jews will not eat them. And it specifically singles them out. The other one here is daman. Though it chews its cud, it has no true hooves, and it is impure for you. Now, just so you can see exactly, right? So we're gonna see if the commentaries.
I just Googled it. I still can't find it.
So that I wanted to show you, because we're not exactly
Unless it's a
100%, 100% sure, but yeah, some people say it's a kind of a big, a really big rat.
Yeah, that's what it looks. Okay, I found it.
So just so you know, yeah, but it's obviously very big. It's not like a normal rat, but this is something that you would have come across. And then some people say it's kind of like maybe even like a rabbit, which it's not something I want to eat, but there are people who enjoy rabbit. I mean, It could be. So some people, in some translations, it sometimes says rabbit. Let me ask the King James, Mary, what do they do? They call it damon, or do they call it a rabbit or something, or a hare?
Call it a coney, C-O-N-E-Y.
And if you look up a coney, look up a coney. Coney is kind of rabbit. Hare. A hare. So it's something like that. Something that we normally would not be eating a lot of, at least in America. This is specifically a hare, the arnevet. Although it chews its cud, it has no true hooves. It is impure for you. So that, that's another animal that we don't think a lot about, but if you have them in your backyard, tearing up your crops, you're like, well, at least I can eat those. No, you can't. So these are probably things that people had that were aggravating because they would eat their crops and then they couldn't even eat them. They could kill them. I had to kill them, get rid of them, but you can't eat them. So, these are things people have. And here specifically our buddy, the pig, the chazir, and that's what we use the word chazer in Hebrew and in Yiddish. A chazer is a pig. And of course, it's not a compliment to call someone a chazer, right? A chazer is somebody who it's somebody who you don't want to be like. And usually we use it in Yiddish to kind of, when we say the same thing in English, which is a pig, it's not somebody it's not a compliment. So I will tell you that in the ancient world and in the modern world, anybody looks at a pig and its behavior and says, yeah, I want to look like that. So there you have it. It is a no-no. Now, is it tough for people to give up? There's no question. Pork is something that people have had a long time. It's been an issue more and more as, of course, Jews have lived amongst their Gentile neighbors, and as they've looked at what makes us unique. And sometimes people say, well, I don't need, my point is, if you live in Israel and you can't find pork a lot of places, you almost have to go out of your way to find it. Well, we don't have to go out of our way. We can go down the street and have carnitas or bacon and all these other things that that are easily had. So it's a little, we live in a different society, and plus again, we live amongst a Gentile community. We share homes with people who are not Jewish, and so it's a much different situation than it was for even our more recent ancestors who just didn't really come into contact with it a lot. The jokes, especially, we had a couple, well, it was literally 10 days ago, Jewish people eat Chinese food on Christmas. The joke even in New York was that God, couldn't see into a Chinese restaurant because they said it was like Superman and lead that God couldn't see into a Chinese restaurant because they were Jews who kept kosher everywhere else, but not in a Chinese restaurant. In a Chinese restaurant, they eat whatever they want. God couldn't see into a Chinese restaurant. Was the old joke from New York. So people had that would be their I don't know, their there was a time when that was kind of like moving into I don't know, American Jewish history, whatever you want to call it. Now we don't even think that much about it. But I saw a funny sign too. Somebody had posted. Somebody, I don't know where it was. I'd show it to you if I had. Somebody posted a sign. There was a sign in front of a Chinese restaurant that said to the Jewish people, we don't understand why your God commanded you to eat Chinese food on Christmas, but we're appreciative. Thank you.
We don't understand your customs and your, yeah.
Why your God commanded you to eat? Why your God commanded you to eat Chinese food on Christmas?
We don't know why, but thank you.
But maybe I can find the picture of it, but I saw somebody posted it. Oh, here it is. I did find it. I don't know if this is real.
It tickled
I
you.
mean, I think it is real. I think somebody actually this actually came from somewhere. So
Looks pretty good. If it's the one I've seen, it's like handwritten.
I'm gonna post it up. You can see this. I'm not making it up. I saw somebody else posted this. It says,
Yeah, that's what I saw too. Yeah, I saw that
right?
too.
Like we don't we're proud and grateful that your God exists. I don't know if that's real. That's I don't even know if there's such a thing as the Chinese Restaurant Association. I think that might be a joke, but
it's funny.
it is funny.
Very funny.
It is
Yeah.
funny. So when people say that when people said that this was their custom, I think people people do have a custom of having Chinese food, and again, it was one of those places, those nexus points where Jews would actually come into contact with non-kosher food, because even restaurants that weren't deemed that didn't go through kosher certification, for a long time, and again, I think there was actually you could almost say that this was a dividing point, and it still is an issue. It's not an issue anymore, but there used to be a real issue for delis, because if they crossed that step and offered, if they offered ham, and cold cuts from non-kosher animals, that was, even if they weren't kosher certified, that was like a hurdle for them to go through. So that even if, again, they weren't kosher, even if they served dairy, or if they served, milk and meat at the same restaurant, that serving that was like a crossing point where people would say,
Right.
Red
flag.
that deli is really not a deli anymore. It's not a Jewish deli because they serve ham sandwiches. And I remember that even in my lifetime being a discussion about what's a legitimate deli. So, I think that there was a point in time when even for people who didn't eat at kosher restaurants, there still was this like one of the few places that they would eat at would be restaurants that had would be the Chinese restaurants where they would see stuff that you would never see. And I think it's indicative of the fact that people used to live in ethnic enclaves where, yeah, there were restaurants, but if you went to the Lower East Side, there wasn't a Mexican restaurant there. I mean, there is now, but in the 1920s, there
Right.
was not there were a lot of restaurants, but there was no Mexican restaurant. People didn't go they didn't, in their neighborhood, they didn't expect there to be, that kind of restaurant. So, yeah, I mean, there'd be 10 kosher restaurants, but there wasn't an Italian restaurant. You'd go around the corner and go to Little Italy, but you didn't find an Italian restaurant on the Lower East Side. So people lived in ethnic enclaves, and those are the restaurants that they went to. And now it's like, if you have to go somewhere else for a burrito, you're like, there's no burrito here, so people, we don't eat like that anymore. We expect there to be a wide variety, even in any neighborhood. So it is what it is. I mean, that's what we live with. So this was an issue, and it was an issue for Jews for a long time, as kind of like a statement of, this is where we live. We can't even find this in our enclave. And I do think even to this day, when people live in an area that's a Jewish area, whether it's Pico Robertson or the parts of say Crown Heights in New York, people, when they live in those enclaves today and they choose to live in those enclaves, they really don't want to see non-kosher. They really don't want to see non-kosher restaurants come into their neighborhood. So they won't, like, if somebody owns the block and they let a non-kosher restaurant in, they're going to take a lot of flack. So they really don't. They don't allow it. Look, it's interesting because when people ask me why when people say, what motivated me to become a vegetarian? Part of it was because I never liked killing animals. I mean, that's a real thing. I didn't like killing animals, but one of the things actually that turned me to vegetarian was eating kosher meat, because the quality of it was so poor, and the attitude of the kosher butchers was so bad that I didn't enjoy eating it, and I didn't like it. And so that was like the final straw, was when it was the years that I ate only kosher meat. I so didn't enjoy it that it almost pushed me. It pushed me over the edge. It didn't almost. It pushed me over the edge of not wanting to have kosher, of not eating meat at all. So it is what it is. There is some people say that's the purpose of kashrut, was to limit our animal intake to begin with. I'll share some of that later, but let's look at this, because it also says here, you shall not eat of their flesh or touch their carcasses. They're impure for you. So you're not supposed to eat them, and you're not supposed to touch them, which of course leads us to question, like, can a Jew touch a football, a pigskin? Can they use a pig, for a pig valve for their bodies? And in the case of a pig valve, it helps someone survive. So the rabbis that said a long time ago, you're allowed to do it, but for just purposes of enjoyment and just having it around, no, you're not supposed to use it. Nowadays footballs aren't made of pigskin anyways, but yeah, you're not supposed to use pigskin for leather and for things that you're using for enjoyment. You're not supposed to use them. You're not supposed to really derive any benefit from them. And that's land animals. I will share with you, since we actually kind of talked about this before, what's going to happen with when we do laboratory created animals. So here's an interesting thing right here that I'll share with you, which is it says in 1997, the conservative movement, the Committee on Law and Jewish Law and Standards, that held it as possible for a genetic sequence to be adapted from a non-kosher species and implanted in a new strain of kosher foodstuff. For example, for a gene of swine growth hormone to be introduced into a potato to induce larger growth, or a gene from an insect to be introduced into a tomato plant to help its resistance, pest resistance. And then in 1990s, the Conference of American Rabbis of Reform Judaism ruled that it's a good thing for a Jew who observes kashrut to participate in a medical experiment involving a pork byproduct. So for medical purposes, obviously, that they should, but again, genes could be derived from it according to the conservative movement. I'm not sure that all movements are going to subscribe to that, and specifically the Orthodox will probably have some specific rules about genetics and about doing that. Complete cell replication, they're going to have to decide whether that's considered a standard of existence, that did the animal ever live? And so that's, or did it live? It lived, but is the animal that you're eating did it ever exist as a living entity? And therefore it couldn't be slaughtered, and therefore are you allowed to eat it? Does it really count as an animal? Was it ever something alive? And I think those are going to be the discussions that will be in the future, in very soon, near future, of whether foods that are laboratory grown, whether they'll be kosher or not, because if they never were a live entity, if they never were slaughtered, are there the same kinds of restrictions on them? So I think, again, there's going to be debates over that.
Mhm.
So this is land animals. Two rules, cud and hooves. Now fish also similarly And maybe again, this is why we move from land animals to fish, which is different than, again, the way the Torah lays out. And again, the Torah lays out animals, divides animals, not by species, not by, not by mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. Or it organizes by where they live. It's so that the biomes or the when we're talking about animals, only three categories: skies, land, and water. And here we started with land, and then we're going to go to water, and then to the skies. So it's in the reverse order of the way the animals were created, which is, again, from waters and land and sky, and then the land. This is kind of in reverse, or not even reverse. It is reverse, but you could say it's also the animals that we come into contact with the most as people who live on the land and who exist on the land. These are the things that we come into contact with the most, but also, as we're about to see, well, let's look at, as we finish them, you'll maybe see the development here, or the thought process. So for the things that live in the water, anything in water, whether in the seas or in the streams, that has fins and scales, these you may eat. So it doesn't matter whether they're freshwater or saltwater, they have to have fins and scales, which in Hebrew are snapir v'kaskeset. Snapir v'kaskeset. Snapir are fins, and kaskeset are scales. Kind of a pretty word, kaskeset. But anything in the seas or in the streams that has no fins and scales, among all the swarming things of the water, and among all other living creatures that are in the water, they are an abomination for you. And an abomination for you, they shall remain. You shall not eat of their flesh. You shall abominate their carcasses, which again is so the land animals, you're not supposed to eat them, and you're not supposed to touch them. Now, everything in the water that has no fins and scales shall be an abomination to you. Okay. And then it goes into birds. So there are literally 1, 2, 3, 4 lines about what you can eat in the water. And essentially one of the lines is repeated twice. Now, no animals are called out in particular, like we had with the land animals, where it talked about, bunnies or whatever, rodents, and of course the pig. There's nothing that's called out. And there are 2 rules which seem at the face of it to be pretty straightforward. And that is the case. When it comes to fish and to things in the water, it's pretty straightforward, which is that pretty much any fish is kosher. Any fish. And by fish, we mean, something with fins and scales that's an actual fish. Anything that's a sea mammal is not kosher, because even if it has fins, like, right, dolphins and killer whale and whale, they're not kosher because they don't have scales. Now, shark don't have true scales. There is, the kind of the easy thing to understand out of this is that, the swarming things of the water include things like shrimp and lobster and all the stuff that people really like to eat today, which were not real common in the ancient world, or at least in the ancient Mediterranean. It's not like they were unheard of, but they weren't super common. Pretty much anything that you'd find in a stream or in a lake, any of those fish were going to be okay. There are freshwater mollusks and things like that, but for the most part, what people would have encountered as a fish would have been fine. There is there is a rule: you don't eat a fish that you found dead, which is always good recommendation for when you're out on a boat. Don't eat a fish that you found floating that was dead already, don't eat it. It's Torah says so, but it also is an example of maybe a rule that helped keep people alive. So for a fish that you found that was a kosher fish, but it was already dead, you don't eat it. So these are the rules about fish. And as you can imagine, this does allow for a lot of types of fish to be eaten. Fish are interesting because when it comes to kashrut, because they're not specifically they're not seen as an animal, as an animal in the sense that land animals are, you can have dairy and fish together. Fish inhabits that status of being parv, it's neither milk, neither dairy nor fleshig, or it's not considered flesh in the same way. And that's why Jews for many, many years have enjoyed lox and cream cheese. It's one of the few meats, if you will, that people can enjoy with dairy. And people would say, well, it doesn't really make sense. It's still an animal. And clearly it was seen as not the same level, where the prohibition of not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, that didn't apply to fish. Look, the argument that some people have made, and I think it's a fair argument to make, is why not chicken? Why can't birds be treated the same? Why are they treated like land animals and not like fish? I would say that probably it deals with the fact, so why is a kid with its mother's milk? Why is a chicken that doesn't have milk, right? There's no chicken milk. Why it can't be done. So why is it included? And I think it's a fair question. I think there's kind of an understanding that, like a land animal, the chicken is something that we encounter on the earth, and I think to some extent it inhabited a kind of space where people said, I can have chicken or I can have beef. I understand that to be a food that's a meat. It's kind of a silly difference, maybe for some people. I would look at it this way: if you eat the animal for breakfast, you probably have it with dairy. If it's going to be more of a lunch or dinner meat, it probably shouldn't. It would, following the laws of kashrut, you wouldn't mix it with dairy. It's kind of a weird thing to look at, but it's fair to say that most people don't have chicken or beef in the morning. I know there's people that eat steak and eggs, but it's not a super common meal, and most people don't eat meat or even chicken for that matter. They'll have eggs, right, and they'll have dairy, they'll have animal byproducts, which we're going to get to in a second, but they're not usually having animals, though they will have fish. People have lox, they'll have kippers, they'll have herring, they'll have different kinds of fish for breakfast, but very rarely will they eat animals, so other kinds of animals. So look, fish are pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot here. So land animals are also pretty straightforward. There's a couple specific things that are held out. I forgot camels are also mentioned. But now we get to birds. Now, birds are a real interesting situation here. And this is where we'll start to maybe, if not see a pattern, maybe it'll elucidate this a little bit. The following you shall abominate among the birds. So that's kind of a weird word, right? Abominate, but that's it's a translation of again, what you're not supposed to eat. It could also be you don't eat. And look at this. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. So the eagle, the vulture, and the black vulture. By the way, before we move on from this, I don't like the word abomination. First of all, it sounds really bad. The word abomination, and again, I'm not saying this because it sounds archaic, and there's a lot of reasons I don't like the word abomination. But so the word here in Hebrew is tishakitsu, and here it's sheket. So that's why it says you shall abominate, and they're an abomination. So tishakitsu is the verb, and then shekets is the noun, which is an abomination. I don't like the word too because it's the root for the Hebrew word and Yiddish word shiksa, which is an abomination. It's a terrible word to call somebody. It's one of the reasons why I don't really use the word. I don't even like to use the word as a joke, and I think it's a bad thing to say. Not because people say it as a joke, but the origin of the word is not a good word. I mean, an abomination is like something you're supposed to, or is really bad, and so it's not a word that I like to use. I don't even like to use the word English word that much, but it's the word that's often used for the word to abominate. It means to stay away from. It means it's not for you. It means it's something to avoid at all costs. But the birds specifically are called out by name. And this is another thing where there's not with birds categories of what invalidates them, what makes them unedible. Because we have a list. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the kite, falcons of every variety, all varieties, all types of raven. The ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, hawks of every variety, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl, the pelican, the bustard, the stork, herons of every variety, the hoopoe, and the bat. That is the list of birds that are not kosher. There are different translations for some of these. So we've reconstructed or used English translations based on cognates in Aramaic and in Arabic, and trying to figure out for sure what the list is. The rabbis discuss it throughout history. Rashi, who lived in the 10th century in France, he calls the animals out by the French names that he knows them. Some of these are guesses. Some of them we're not 100% sure, what they are. Obviously, all these animals have in common is they eat other animals. They eat other birds. They eat carrion. They eat animals and eat flesh and are higher up the food chain in the sense that they are not animals that we know what they've eaten because they'll eat anything. Now, I know people have said chickens will eat anything either. Anything you put in front of a chicken, they'll eat, including other chickens. And they do actually today. This is one of the arguments about some of the farm-raised chickens are that they feed them chicken. They feed them chicken matter so that they get bigger. Cannibal, they're essentially cannibal chickens, which kind of scary. But this is what makes them not kosher as a species are these animals that would eat another animal. So it seems as though for land animals, that's really any animal that chews its cud by nature, by physiology, can't really eat other animals. They can only eat grass. They can only eat, they have to be herbivores in order to be ruminants. It doesn't say that specifically, but that's the case. Any animal with a multiple stomach is going to have is going to be eating plant-based. And for the most part, the birds that are eliminated again off this list are animals that eat other animals. They eat carrion. They eat their own species. They eat fish. They eat things that, again, the higher up the food chain you go, the less ability you have of controlling whether they're eating something that's healthy or not healthy. And so the argument has been made that the laws of kashrut help people stay alive, especially in the ancient world, before they understood about bacteria and about viruses, that if you have animals that don't eat other animals, you're at least controlling what they're eating, what they're consuming. And therefore, if you consume them, you're only consuming one step up above grain. So that was the argument, that this actually helps preserve life by stopping people from eating animals that might have died of disease, and therefore you're not eating their carcasses, even if they're kosher animals, and that you're eating animals that wouldn't have eaten another animal that might have been contaminated. So this
There's
really
great wisdom in there. There's
Great-
wisdom in there.
that it's been proven, right, Joyce? So this
Yeah.
is something that we know. I've made this point before, and I've said it before, and I just read another article about it today. If and we don't know for sure, but if COVID-19 spread out of a, and we don't know for sure, but if it spread out of a Chinese wet market in Wuhan, which is at least one of the accepted theories, and I want to say it's an accepted theory by people on the right and on the left, and according to what you'll read in look, it might not be true, by the way. I'm not saying it was. I'm not saying it wasn't created in a lab, and I'm not saying anything other than there is a common theory and an accepted theory by people of all different political values and feelings that this came out of a wet market in Wuhan. If that's the case, then 100%, if that's the case, that if kashrut had been followed, it wouldn't have existed. Doesn't mean that it did, and I'm not stating, because we don't know. But if the theory is true, then that's true too. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. So I didn't say that kashrut would have stopped this from happening. I'm saying if that is what had happened, then kashrut would have stopped it from happening. So we can postulate that over the centuries, that there was probably an effect of Jews not eating or restricting the animals that they ate, which led to Jews having a healthier lifestyle.
Survival.
And so that we can say, based on all scientific information that we would have, that would be the case. Is it what can we say beyond that? I don't, you can draw your own decisions from that, your own inferences, and you can come to your own conclusions from this. But from the standpoint of these laws trying to preserve life, that we can say. So while I shared that midrash with you at the beginning, which I didn't really love, which is, these are the laws that you want to give to people who are going to live, change it to the fact that for people who care about life, and for people of any persuasion and any religion and any group that want to live and that do care about life, sometimes the doctor tells you to do something to protect your life. If you don't care about life and you don't care about living, then eat anything you want. Eat anything you want. And again, that goes for, the kinds of foods that we consume, the things we put in our bodies on all levels, not just meat. So there is a certain wisdom to that too, which is that if you want to live, this is what you need to do. And since Joyce is here, I say whatever Joyce is doing, do that. Whatever Joyce is eating, that's the diet you need to follow. So whatever Joyce is not eating, don't eat it. Whatever she's eating, eat it. That's the only thing you need to do, is follow Joyce's diet. That's what you need to do. But it really is about, it's about living. And these laws are to help people live. So you can see the animals, and again, for I always think about these animals that these birds that Mike Schwartz really loves the eagle, and so we were always remind you whenever we come to this section of the animals that we're not allowed to eat. The eagle is on that list of animals that you're not supposed to eat. You're supposed to
And
leave
we
them.
won't call it an abomination.
Exactly. It's not.
Right.
I don't like that word.
Absolutely.
But
And
yes, and so
we don't
Right.
want to have an eagle sandwich.
No,
No,
we won't
no
call
eagle
them an
sandwiches.
abomination. We won't call them abomination. We stay away from them. We leave them alone. And
Right.
the same thing goes for the swarming things that walk on all fours. And from this, we're talking, of course, about things like mice and gophers
Ah.
and things that we do not want to. Oh no, these are the wing swarming things. First, I forgot. We're still in the wing stuff. We're going to get back to the crawling things in a second. All wing swarming things that walk on all fours shall be an abomination for you. And so this would be the crickets and grasshoppers, and this is where we get. This is where we get an exception. But these among you may eat of all the wing swarming things that walk on all fours, all that have above their feet jointed legs to leap with on the ground. Of these you may eat of the following: locusts of every variety, all varieties of bald locusts, crickets of every variety, and all varieties of grasshoppers. But other winged swarming things that have 4 legs shall be an abomination to you. So again, there's some species of crickets and things like that have wings that are not kosher. Why are locusts kosher? We've discussed this before, which is that if you have a field of grain and locusts ate up all your grain, the only thing you can eat are locusts. And so it's almost like in a society, in a world where that could happen, you can't be left without anything to eat. So it's the one exception to which is that you're allowed to eat locusts. So pretty much every other kind of insect, as we're going to see, is not kosher. So that was like the thing that you could eat, because everything else you can't. And the following shall make you impure. Whoever touches their carcasses shall be impure until evening. And whoever carries the carcasses of any of them shall wash those clothes and be impure until evening. Every animal.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I need to interject.
Yeah, we're not done, so don't worry. Yeah.
No. We have guests here, so I'm gonna have to launch. But I'll see you Friday night at Shabbat. So
All right.
so
Well,
say goodbye to everybody. Mike, I hope you feel better. And Joyce, am I picking you up?
Friday night? Yes.
Okay.
All right, guys. Stay dry. You have to read on your own, John. You got to read about things that have paws that walk on their fours that you can't eat either. Okay?
Oh,
Make sure
okay.
you can't eat your dog. All
I
right.
know. I'm not eating my dog. All right. everybody.
Or any cute mice. All right. Bye.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So
Bye.
we're not done with the animals. There are little excursus into the carcasses, which we already heard, but it also talks about carrying them. Every animal that has true hooves but without clefts in the hooves, or that does not chew their cud, they're impure for you. Whoever touches them shall be impure. So you think that it's over, but it's not. And it's kind of weird because we have this list of things you're not supposed to eat, and then it goes into not touching them again. And here it goes back to
Oh, don't pet a camel.
that's true, actually, right? Well, yeah. Well, this says carcasses. This says carcasses. Yeah, this is carcasses.
Oh, all right.
Carcasses. Also, animals that walk on paws, among these that walk on fours, are also impure. For whoever touches their carcasses shall be impure. Carcasses.
Okay.
Anyone who carries their carcasses shall wash those clothes and remain impure until evening. They are impure for you. I guess you could say that if you touch any of those animals, as long as they're not dead, you're not impure. But once they're dead, then you have to worry about it. So now these are the swarming land things. These are not wing things. These are now things that crawl around or that are on the ground that are not kosher. And this is going to get into lizards and amphibians and those kinds of things, and the rodents. The following shall be impure for you among that swarm on earth: the mole, the mouse, the great lizards of every variety, the gecko, the land crocodile, the lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. Those are for you, the impure among all the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be impure until evening, and anything on which of them falls when dead shall be impure, be it any article of wood or cloth or of skin or a sack, or any such article that can be put to use shall be dipped in water, and it shall be remain impure until evening, and then it shall be pure. So look, you could say this is kind of specific and it deals with these animals would render things impure, not unkosher, but impure. There's a difference. They're impure when their bodies come into contact with them.
Mhm.
What's interesting about that is that if they're alive and they so if a mouse runs over your thing, it doesn't make it impure. It doesn't say that. It says when they're dead. So what's interesting about this, and again, I would say it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, which is these laws seem to be based on a wisdom of keeping people alive.
Mhm.
If they're dead, they might have been exposed to some kind of contaminant, a bacteria, a virus, or something
Mhm.
that killed them, that if you come in contact with, you could die. And so
Right.
what you have to do with it is you have to wash it off, dip it in water, and
Brilliant.
you leave it alone and give it time, maybe for the virus to die. Now, again, we know that some cases, viruses and bacteria, it takes longer for them to die, but they do eventually die. And what's interesting about this is that all these steps that they're taking actually, again, do they always? Maybe not, especially if a virus lasts for long. Even though they didn't understand about bacteria, even though they couldn't look at under a microscope and see a virus, they understood that there's something here that can make you sick, that could potentially kill you. And so this stops those diseases from happening. And again, I mean, look, 30 to 60% of Europe died during the plague. I mean, the theory is that, over 50% of Europe was wiped out during the plague. I mean, 50 million people died during the Spanish flu epidemic of 100 years ago.
Mhm.
This is real. And even though people didn't understand the science behind it and they couldn't prove how it happened, they knew it happened. And so here we have laws in the Torah that are thousands of years old that say if you come into contact with a dead animal, especially these animals that you and I know can spread disease real easily. And again, they didn't know that bubonic plague was carried by a flea that infected a mouse. They didn't understand that, but they did know that mice would spread disease. And if they were dead, they could be dead for a reason. They could have been dead
Mhm.
because they got sick.
So the
these are
rules
really-
were protective.
yeah, this is a really, really amazing rule. And
Mhm.
would have kept people potentially, again, help them survive. So if any of those fall into an earthen vessel, everything inside it shall be impure, and the vessel itself you shall break. So that's expensive, but
Mhm.
again, if you can't be sure you really got it all out, you gotta break it. You can't use it. As to any food that may be, it shall become impure if it came into contact with water. Now, look at this note, because if it came into contact with water, it came into contact with the carcass of any of the animal
Mhm.
that that the water came in contact with, to any liquid that may be drunk, it shall become impure as if it was inside any vessel. And so what it's saying is the water can also
Carry the
cross-contaminate.
disease.
And it's true, it can. And there's people who've gotten sick even today, it's kind of scary, but people will get sick though from cross contamination from a cutting board where people were cutting meat, and then they'll have vegetables on that same cutting board, and they can get salmonella. It can, even though it's not natural for for diseases that are spread and are found in animals, if they come into contact with water and then with the vegetables, they can be on the vegetables. And so it happens all the time. I mean, people get sick and die today from having cross contamination from liquid, from water, even that's on a cutting board. And it happens. It happens right now. So everything on which the carcass of any of them falls shall be impure. An oven or a stove shall be smashed. They are impure, and impure they shall remain for you. So if it falls into an oven, you had to destroy the oven. That's a huge expense. It's a huge expense. And so this is an issue of expense for people, and it's something that there are arguments or discussions within the Bible, within the Talmud, of this biblical law. In particular, certain types of ovens, whether they can be rendered kosher again, or not kosher, but pure, tahor again, after they've come into contact with a carcass of one of these mice, for example. So there's discussions about this, of whether an animal can render the whole oven impure, or can the part of the oven be taken out, scraped off and then reused. This is a big issue, and it's one because it would have happened, and it can happen easily. So you can imagine that people had to be very careful with their ovens, that they would lock them or close them in such a way that animals couldn't get in and out of the oven. And they did everything they could to not let their ovens be contaminated, because they could have to destroy them if they had animals, if little creatures could get in there, especially mice. And so there are discussions about it in the Talmud, and people are like, do we really have to destroy the whole oven? Can't we take out the tiles? And it's not an oven that where it's a single piece. There's actually a famous discussion we looked at before, the Tanur Shalachnai, the question of the oven, whether it was kosher or not, or it could be made pure. I keep saying kosher, but be made impure. What was impure, could it be made pure? And there's a whole discussion about it in the Talmud of whether that oven could be kosher, and it leads to a whole debate amongst the rabbis. But it was an oven discussion of this text, which is about the ovens. Look, I can only tell you this: it is an issue. It's still an issue, and generally speaking, there's a reason why we have health inspectors that go into restaurants and monitor whether they're clean or not. Because we know that disease can very easily be spread through a restaurant, of food handlers who are not being careful. And so, in my opinion, one of the most important things that the government does and should do is maintain food safety. I think that if there's one thing that my government does, besides fielding a well-run military for defense, the other thing it really needs to do is make sure that there's food safety, and that people are on a local level and on the federal level are not taking advantage of for the sake of money, or for the sake of profit motive, are not doing anything that's going to be unsafe for people, and quite frankly, for laziness or basic lack of health standards. It's very important for the government to intervene and to make sure that people are serving food in a safe way. So I take those things seriously, and I really do. I have very little tolerance for a restaurant that has got a ever had a B rating. Once they've had a B rating in my book, they're off the list. And my wife will say, "Oh, they don't have a B rating anymore." As far as I'm concerned, you get a B rating. I don't give them. There's not a second or third strike. I have very little tolerance for that, and far too many kosher restaurants, by the way, in LA that had a B, and in some cases had C ratings. I went into a restaurant once with somebody down in Pico Robertson area, and they had a C rating. I'm like, "How could you go into this restaurant? It has a C rating." He goes, "Oh, no, it's good." I'm like, "I'm not eating here." Guys said, "Oh, no, it's a really good place." I'm like, "Dang, how do you get a C?" I mean, that doesn't even seem possible. So I will tell you that it's a serious issue. It should be an issue within the Jewish community because we have these rules about keeping stuff clean. And yeah, I to me, for people who've gotten lazy with their food safety, it goes against, I think, Jewish principles. So whether the person's Jewish or not, we shouldn't be putting our lives in jeopardy by eating food that could be prepared in an unsafe way. It's just the bottom line. And so it goes for ovens. And here is an interesting rule that a spring or a cistern in which water is collected shall be pure, but whoever touches such a carcass in it shall be impure. If such a carcass, if a carcass falls in the water, you got to be careful. Okay. So this is a problem. A carcass that falls on seed grain that is sown, it is pure. But if water is put on the seed or any part of the carcass falls upon it, it shall be impure for you. So dry seeds are not an issue, but once it's got water on it and it's dry, it was dry and now it's got water, then they're saying it's impure. The Torah is saying. So again, it seems to me like they understood this. They understood the fact that water could be an agent of, could cross-contaminate. If an animal that you made has died, anyone who touches it, if an animal that you made, right, this is a kosher animal, has died, anyone who touches its carcass shall be impure until evening. Anyone who eats of its carcass shall wash those clothes and remain impure until evening. And anyone who carries its carcass shall wash those clothes and remain impure until evening. So if you come into contact, and if you ate it, you're impure. You literally have to go through a process of essentially being quarantined a little bit. Some would say, well, you're not quarantined enough for it to have real impact, but something. And it's definitely a way to dissuade people from doing it by forcing them out of the community and essentially, again, rendering them tameh, which is impure. All the things that swarm upon the earth are an abomination. They shall not be eaten. You shall not eat among all things that swarm on the earth, anything that crawls on its belly or anything that walks on fours or anything that has many legs, for there are abomination. And again, here it's kind of almost like anything else that we haven't listed, from mice, from rodents, from any type of lizard, any type of animal that we haven't listed as far as things that are on the land. Those things aren't kosher, and so they kind of open it up to pretty much anything that doesn't chew its anything that doesn't chew its cud and have split hooves. And so for all those animals that are almost like, in some cases, how do we even know? We can't even see. We can't, it's so small. It's not really it's not, doesn't really apply because it's an insect or it's a it's something that you've never seen before. I mean, parts of the world you wouldn't have seen a Gila monster if you lived in the Middle East. You wouldn't have seen a tarantula. There's animals that you maybe wouldn't have seen. Scorpions, they did see, but there's animals that might not have been in the Middle East, but if they're introduced later on, or if you live somewhere outside of the Middle East later on, and you come into contact with them, it's basically saying none of them are kosher. You can't eat them. So they're not to be eaten. They are shekets. You shall not draw upon abomination upon yourselves through anything that swarms. You shall not make yourselves impure therewith, and thus become impure. So the last line of this, or the last, the last lines of this portion. For I, Adonai, am your God. You shall sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not make yourselves impure through any swarming thing that moves on the earth. For I, Adonai, am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. And this is where we start getting into some very special language in the Torah, and specifically in the book of Leviticus, what we call the holiness code, which is about being holy. Hitem kadoshim ki kadosh ani. You're holy because I'm holy. And then it says, these are the instructions concerning animals, birds, all living creatures that move in water, and all the creatures that swarm on earth. So here they kind of actually do it in four categories, which are animals, birds, fish, and then things that swarm on the earth, which they almost see as a separate category from land animals. But for the most part, maybe because, again, you could say that they're not quite land animals. Things like lizards and those kind of things that we said, that the creature and insects that they swarm on earth are not really land animals, but that's maybe why they're like a fourth category. But essentially, this is again the way that was laid out for distinguishing between the impure and pure, between the living things that may be eaten and all the living things that may not be eaten. So here at the end, it doesn't say the words abomination. It does say, specifically though, these are the words that are tahor, these are the ones that are holy, and these are the ones that are tameh, that are impure. And essentially, again, the priests are to some extent in charge of deciding what is impure and pure. It's their job to decide that. And so you could say that's why it's in the book of Leviticus, because the priests are the ones who are going to help decide that. And as we get into, and you're going to see now, we'll read a little bit of it, as we get into Tazri and Matzorah, where the priests also try to figure out what's holy and what's pure and impure, or what's clean and unclean, I would say. When it comes to the body, to a physical body, the priests are the ones who are making those decisions, and they're helping to teach people and guiding people in this. This is why it's in Leviticus, but the laws definitely apply to everybody. And what's interesting here is it doesn't say, these are the instructions only for the priests. These are only priests that have to do this. Everybody does it. And what is special about these laws, as we've said many times, is they're definitely laws that help us be safe. It helps us in our holiness and in our physical and spiritual health. But there's also something really interesting about this, which is that in the context of Leviticus, where we see this, it doesn't specifically say it's for just the priests. And what's very interesting is that in the ancient world, and even to some extent amongst modern groups, there were rules that the priests had to have in a faith, in a tradition, in a group. And other people didn't have to follow those rules. Only the priests would have to follow those rules. So while there's no special rules for priests in Catholicism, for example, when it comes to eating, priests are allowed to eat and drink everything that everyone else is. There are rules that priests have to follow, specifically, let's just say the laws of chastity. These are rules that only priests have to follow. Now, the average ordinary Catholic doesn't have to follow those rules. There are other traditions in the ancient world where we're not, those religions don't necessarily exist anymore, where the priests were, and are also, we know about them from historical texts. But even, for example, there are groups in India where, Hindu traditions, which are, some of them are very ancient, where certain people, a priestly class wasn't allowed to eat certain things, but other people, that were their students or their followers, did. And even to some extent, there are some in Buddhism, there's some traditions of certain groups within certain groups of monks, of Buddhist monks that will, for example, there are some Buddhist traditions in China where the monks will be vegetarian, but the people who go to the people who follow the average Buddhist say wasn't necessarily vegetarian, but the monks were. So
Does it
what's
also
interesting-
apply in the caste system? Different castes could eat different things?
Yeah, in some traditions. In Hinduism today, for example, all Hindus that were following tradition were not supposed to eat cow, but there are Hindu traditions where people, it's not so much through the caste system, but through some of the Hindu sects where they would not eat, where some of the Hindu groups would not eat any animals. And it's the same thing. It's actually I'm only saying it because I've been there and I've seen it with my own eyes, where when I've been to China, where some of the monasteries, the people will, the monks won't eat meat, but the average person in China, they're like, they'll eat anything. But the monks won't. I told this story before. I had, when I've gone to China, the people will always, first of all, they're always very nice to me. When they tell people that I'm Jewish or that I'm a rabbi, they're very excited by it. They usually are very respectful and very excited to meet Jews. But when they tell them that I'm a vegetarian, it'll be interesting to see what I'll get, because sometimes they say I don't eat animals, and then like one time they served me a plate of bugs, and I said, no, I don't eat bugs. It's not meat. It's not meat. And I go, yeah, but it's I don't eat bugs. I consider it an animal. So they were trying to be nice by serving me a plate of bugs, and then of course I had to, the guy who took me was a meeting, a business meeting, and the guy was he was like, "You're going to offend these people. They made you the plate of bugs." I said, I don't know what to tell you. I'm not eating the bugs. So I was pretty insistent, not eating the bugs. And so they ate the bugs. Everyone else, ate off the plate of bugs in front of me, which, was not fun to listen to people crunching while we were talking, but I couldn't get it out of my head. I still can't get it out of my head, but it's funny what they come up with as vegetarian though. But I did get to eat at some really nice vegetarian restaurants in Shanghai where they did a really great job making real vegetarian food, I think. I mean, no, I'm sure it was, but I hope it was. But in all fairness, it is interesting when you go to a country, especially a country like China, where you're never really sure what's going on, whether food safety is, what kind of food safety is being installed, is in play. And they do have ratings, at least in some cities. They have ratings of the food. They'll give it a rating, a food rating. And my friend another guy took me to a Chinese restaurant that had the ratings were green, yellow, and red. And I can only imagine what a red restaurant in China was. But he took me to the restaurant and it was a yellow ranked restaurant. And it was good. It seemed pretty simple. It didn't seem like they could have screwed it up that much. But I'm like, that's a yellow. Why are we going to a yellow restaurant? And he says, those ratings don't mean anything because people just pay. If they don't pay, they don't get the rating. If they do pay, they get a better rating. And I thought to myself, he's probably right, because I know how rampant the corruption is in China.
Bribery.
It's like, I know that because I've seen them do it. I've seen them like right in front of me bribing people. So it's like, I didn't really know what to say. So I kind of, I went with it. It was very simple. It was like this place they made up these kind of pancakes, like some kind of pancake with vegetable in it. It seemed pretty simple. So I had it, and it was very good, but I was, and I have to say, I've never been sick when I've eaten in China. So I have to say, whatever has happened, I haven't gotten sick, but like, I don't know how. Like, I'm not really sure, because I do have some sensitivities, but I never did. So I don't know what to say other than I don't know. I haven't, but it is weird to think what people eat in other countries. And for the most part, again, even though obviously there's a lot of, as we're saying, a lot of non-kosher options in America, a lot of the animals that we went through just now, we wouldn't even think about eating them in America, but in other parts of the world, 100%. You can go to, well, obviously China is one of the largest, I mean, it's the largest country population-wise. I guess India is now pretty close, but you can go to these restaurants, you can go to a restaurant and order a plate of I mean, not every restaurant, but you can go to restaurants and order stuff that you'd be like, how are they eating this? So, to some extent, even though I'm not implying that we're eating kosher in America, but there are standards of what we would eat, are in many ways, I think, consistent with the Torah to the extent that there's things here that we wouldn't even like think of eating. So, and that isn't the case in other parts of the world. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying we're kosher country, but I am saying, believe it or not, there's a lot of stuff that are consistent with our diet, which we would say, oh, well, we wouldn't even think about it. So we're going to start reading a little bit into Tazria. That would be a good place for us to break, but I want to read a little bit into Tazria just so you can see that the Torah. This ends the chapter of Shmini, which talked about the death of Nadav and Avihu, and then went into Kashrut. And you can see this is kept as one chapter by the Christian editors who made it one chapter. And they made chapter 11 one chapter of kosher animals, and it's 47 verses. So it's a long chapter, but again, they felt it shouldn't break. And for us as Jews, this is also the end of the parsha of Shmini, which begins again with the death of Nadav and Avihu on the 8th day, as we said, on the 8th day that the temple was dedicated, on the ordination of the priests and of the opening the ordination cycle, the 7-day cycle was complete, and then the temple is open for business. Oh, I did want to say one thing. If we look at the very last verse, though, the very last verse of the Torah portion of the portion and the last portion of the animals, it says lahavdil ben hatameh uben hatahor, to distinguish between the impure and the pure. And so what's interesting about this is that that the Hebrew word here, lahavdil, which like the word havdalah means to distinguish, that there is an understanding here that what we do when we distinguish between what's kosher and what's not kosher is we're doing something that is at least in Jewish tradition, is not something that's inherently evil or inherently bad. To make a distinguish between something, generally today we're saying, well, who are you to judge? This is this and this is that. That it's seen as a everything should be the same. Everything is gray. Everything is the same, and everything is there's no differences. There's not a line between things. The Torah actually is very insistent that there are differences, that there's differences between things that are pure, that are impure. There's a difference between light and darkness. And it's the same word that we use, lahavdil ben yom uven laila, between day and night. There's a difference. That everything is not day, everything's not night. There are differences. There's a day and there's a night. And there's it's all part of a day, but there is a part of the day that's this, and there's a part of the day that's that. And we live in a world today that really doesn't want there to be anything distinguished, because the feeling is that if you distinguish something that one thing is this and one thing is that, and that one thing is good and one thing is bad. In the case of certain things that we decide in life, there might be things that are tameh, and there's certain things that are tahor, certain things that are impure and certain things that are pure. But to distinguish, and the Torah actually tells us this, to distinguish between two things does not necessitate that one thing's good and one thing's bad, because it doesn't say that day is good and night is bad. It says there's a day and there's a night. And God saw that the whole thing was good. And so sometimes differences are just simply saying one thing is this and one thing is that. Sometimes we say this is good and then this is bad. There are times when we do that, but not every time we make a distinguishing between two things is one thing good and one thing bad. It's okay to say that there's two things that are different from each other and that one isn't good and one isn't bad. They're both good. They both can be fine.
Mhm.
But we seem to imply in our world today, anytime that you make something you make a distinguishing that you're making one thing bad and one thing good. That's not the case. And so rather than just saying we're not going to distinguish anything anymore, there is no we're not distinguishing anything. We're going to throw away any type of separation. Can't have it. What we do is we're literally hamstringing ourselves. We're saying we're no longer going to be able to say that two things are different from each other. And again, partly it's because, we have the discussions between, obviously it comes down a lot of times to a issue of gender identity, that, there's a man and a woman, and no, there's not a man and a woman. There's gender fluidity. There isn't a, that if we make a distinction between one or the other, that one thing's good and one thing's bad. This is actually something that we're like in the midst of right now. We're literally in the midst of people saying, well, if you're making binary decisions, then you're making one thing bad and one thing good, or that by ever making any kind of distinguishing of something, that it's bad. Just because you make a decision between two things, and it could be three things, and it could be four things, because there isn't always just there's not always two decisions, but to make a decision isn't necessarily bad. There are some times when we make decisions that one thing is good and one thing's bad, but it doesn't mean everything that we decide is a binary decision between good and bad. And so there are binary decisions, there's non-binary decisions, and there's also decisions that we make that, again, we have to decide this is okay, this is not okay. And if we decide that we're not going to make any decisions, then we're literally we're taking away our ability to do anything to protect and to save ourselves from destruction. Because if people say, well, you can't decide that's good or bad, well, then how do you decide whether something's healthy or unhealthy? So somebody's going to say, well, you can't say that that's unhealthy, because that's what we're going to come to. We're rapidly coming to a time when somebody's going to say, well, you can't say that because somebody else wants to do that, or because it's you've made a decision and now you've said, oh, one thing is you've made it, you've distinguished. And so
You made a judgment, and they want you not to use judgment.
And this word right here, Joyce, will have deal, distinguish, is going to literally become I think is going to make the difference between our society. There are going to be some segments of our society that are going to literally make the separation. Interestingly, ironically, the distinguishment between our society will be between those who are willing to make decisions and those who are not willing to make decisions. And that will be the dividing line in our society between people who are really going to say, I'm not going to distinguish anything. I don't want to distinguish anything because I don't want to subjectively critique something, and it's not fair and it's not right, and it's, you can't say that that's this, you can't say that. So what will happen is that people will literally separate themselves, and they will become a separate society, and there'll be another set of society that's going to say you can't live if you don't distinguish between things.
Right.
And so this last word here in the portion, to me, it's so interesting, because it goes back to the very beginning. And I'm just actually, this is where we're going to finish, because I just want you to see this with your own eyes. When God creates the universe, right? God literally says, I'm going to make the universe, right? God says, God saw the light and he saw the darkness. and he separated Vayavdel. God separated the light from the darkness. And when God separates things, it's part of creation. It's actually necessary for there to be creation. I'm going to show you in the second day of creation, let there be an expanse in the midst of the water, that it may separate from the water. It says God separated. It says right here, Vayavdil, Vayihi Mavdil. That's the same root, like Havdil. Or again, like we had right here, Vayavdel. The word is to separate. It may separate the water from the water. It's only through these separations. Look at it right here. God made the expanse and separated the water from below from the water which was above. Vayavdel, it's the same word. Over and over again, when God creates the universe, God is separating one thing from another. It's not dangerous. It's not bad. It's not subjective, and it's not evil. On the contrary, it's actually necessary for there to be creation. There literally needs to be something on one side and something on the other. Some would say a yin and yang, that there has to be a balance. There has to be two separate things. And so God makes these separations, and we see it throughout creation, that literally God is creating by separating. And so, I guess my takeaway from this, and my lesson from it that I think about a lot, is if you destroy those, if you remove the separations that God put on, then you destroy creation. And I'm not making a statement that like every difference that exists between people is a binary. I didn't say that, but there's a lesson here, which is that if you destroy the reality that there's differences, then you destroy creation. You're literally pulling apart the fabric of creation in order to get to what someone would say is a fair world. But in reality, what of course it does is it unravels creation, and it creates total chaos. It creates total anarchy. So what happens in these separations is actually the ability for life to exist. Life exists in that liminal moment between one thing and another. And to disregard that is literally disregarding creation, and it's disregarding a truth, which is there's a liminal moment, which is the end of our life. When we pass from this world to the next, it's an objective truth. You're alive or you're dead. If there's no difference, then what is life? And so I don't understand how you can't define anything without having some differences, without some separation. And so I find it interesting that people are trying to destroy the ability to determine one thing from the other. And so we'll wind up with nothing. We wind up with chaos because there's no differentiation. There's nothing to say. And again, it doesn't mean that there's only two things. And it also doesn't mean that one thing is good and one thing is bad, but there are differences. And we judge our differences by, again, it helps us understand who we are by understanding the differences. If we say this is what we do and this is what somebody else does, then we understand what it is that we do. And I think that's one of the things that Judaism has tried to say is, look, we're going to do things different. It doesn't make us bad, and it doesn't make you bad. It doesn't make one good and one bad, but there are differences, and we'll judge ourselves by our differences. And the judgment isn't necessarily always that one's good and one's bad, but there's a necessity to it. And that's what our, the last line of that essentially is, again, not one bad, one good all the time. Sometimes they are, though. And I'll leave you with that. I hope that didn't come across like I'm saying anything is bad or anything's necessarily bad because it's on one side of it or the other. But again, I would say it's inherent to creation. Again, God does the very beginning is literally making a separation between light and dark, which is essentially the difference in time. There was a time of timelessness, and then there was a time when there was day and night, when there was energy that became differentiated between a time when there was no time, and then there was a time when we could measure time. And I think science has taught us that too. I mean, we still are understanding the cosmology and the way the universe came into existence, but we're still understanding string theory, and we're just trying to come up with, again, what things look like. But was there a time when there was no time, and then there was a time when there was? I mean, these are questions that we're still trying to come up with. But again, let's not be afraid of this word right here, of mavdil, of differences. So
Mhm.
all right, everybody, please stay safe, stay dry for those of us in California. Don't, I guess would say, be careful when you're driving out there. Mike, keep healing, and everybody else keep yourselves dry and safe wherever you are. And we will see you soon.
Bye there.
Take care, everybody. It's good to see y'all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.